Masking tape, one sentiment stamp, and inks in your favorite festive colors. It's all you need to make these 9 quick, flat, last-minute card designs. Let's get started. I chose my favorite Christmas color combination, at least this year, and that's a split complementary. I've got 2 reds, Samba and Rouge, and then green tea, which is a yellow-green, and Skylight, which is a green-blue. I'm going to do all the backgrounds first, and then we'll talk about sentiments and finishing them, from very basic to stepping them up. I'm using 1-inch post-it tape that's available in craft stores, but also on Amazon and office supply stores too. You can use regular painter's masking tape. You just want something that's sticky all over, but not so sticky it'll rip your paper when you remove it. This first one is super easy. Just mask off a strip near the bottom of your card panel, and then blend your colors over that edge. The nice thing about blending such a small area is that it's super fast and it's easy to get a good blend. The nice thing about using a piece of straight tape is that it reduces the amount of measuring needed. So here I used a piece of tape along my left edge, and then a second piece right up next to it, and then a third right next to that. And then when I removed the second piece, I had a 1-inch strip exposed that's 1 inch away from the edge of my panel. I blended my 4 colors down the strip, but this time I did smaller areas, so there's more than one spot with each color on it. I worked in kind of a rainbow order to minimize any blending of red and green, which might give me a kind of a brown color. Card 3 is just the reverse of card 2. This time I put a strip of tape across my panel and then I blended my inks on the rest of the panel. I put the darker red close to the top edge of the tape and then I blended it out into the Samba. And what you're seeing here is the difference between an ink pad that's a bit thirsty and another one that's properly inked up. And that's a really good ink blending tip. Make sure your ink pads are fully loaded. That's going to give you a much easier time. Below the tape, I put the Skylight ink along that edge, and then I blended up from the bottom with my green tea ink. I thought it would be fun to do some thinner stripes for card 4, but I still want to use the 1-inch tape to help me avoid having to measure too much. So I put my first strip down. I do find it easier to see the edge properly when I work on the edge closest to me. Then I just eyeballed where to put the next strip of tape, and I tried to make sure that it was as parallel as possible. Then I worked up so that I would have a stripe above and below my third piece of tape. I had to adjust it a little bit to make sure that the 3 exposed areas were about the same width, and then I blended my 2 red inks down. I removed those pieces of tape, and then I used the top of each inked stripe to be the top of each strip of tape, so that left another 3 areas to blend, and this time I used the blue and green. You could fill in those last 3 strips if you wanted to, but I just left them white. And of course, these stripes can be vertical or horizontal, whatever you prefer. Or you could do both and create kind of a plaid if you wanted to. Okay, now we've done a lot of straight lines. How about some angles? I put a piece of tape across the panel at about 2/3 of the way up from the bottom. If you don't have masking tape, or if you just want something that's a little more reusable, how about using some pieces of acetate? I've added tape to the edges of these to keep them visible on my desk, and you can see that I've written on them with a Sharpie. That helps me to remember which side of the acetate the ink will be on. You do not want to put that inky side down on your project. I placed them on the panel to create a triangle, and they are able to stick to the grip mat to keep them in place while I blend the green and blue ink over. So while we're doing triangle trees, here's a simple variation, one that you've probably seen a million times, and you've probably done it yourself. I put a strip of tape along the bottom of my panel, and then I used more to create smaller triangles, and I made them overlap to create a colorful row of trees. I like to try and vary the heights, although you don't have to, as well as the width of the trees, to create different amounts of overlap. The only important thing is to try to make sure that your angles are somewhat equal and the tip of each tree is in the center of the base, or they're going to look a little wonky. Oops, I got a smudge. This happened because that tape was on top of some red ink that was still wet, and it picked it up and then put it back down in what was supposed to be my clean white sky. I'm sure there's a new technique in there somewhere, but I'm not going to let this slow me down. I'll figure it out in post, as we say in the photo and video world. And just for good measure, I did a single small triangle, not really a tree this time, although it could be. It's just kind of a colorful pointer toward the area where my sentiment will be. This next layout is inspired by Pristine Paper Co., a fellow Toronto card maker who has a great eye for design. I mask off the bottom of my panel, but on an angle this time, and I blended the green tea and Skylight ink onto that. Then my tape wouldn't stiff because that ink's still wet. And as I'm watching this now, I'm thinking, honey, don't you ever learn? And I'm being very thankful that I didn't end up with another smudge. But what I did do was shorten the amount I needed to mask by putting the vertical strip down first, and then the sort of horizontal strip down before blending the dark and light red ink upwards. For card 9, the most simple and most complicated techniques. First, simple. I use the tape around all 4 edges to mask off an area in the center. Oh, I should say that all of these designs can easily be adapted to A2 cards if you're not into squares like I am. And of course, any color combination will work. So if I just blended the colors inside, that would be easy. But I decided to go for a more modern art look by masking off strips within the center square. And not straight strips this time, but kind of angled, non-parallel, and overlapping strips. I don't really have a formula for this. I know that's surprising. I just kept moving the tape and adding my inks one at a time until I had everything covered. So here's my 9 panels. I could keep going, but I'm sure you get the point. I love how the focus is really on the colors. And as long as you keep your hands clean, and your tape for that matter, they are really crisp with lots of white space. I trimmed them all down from 4¼ inch squares to 4-inch squares before moving on. I chose one sentiment stamp to use for all 9 of my cards. This is a new set from Sunbird Spark, and joy is one of my favorite words at Christmas. I chose a position on each of the panels, and I used one of the pieces of acetate to help me with that, and that meant I could move the stamp around without cleaning it for each different design, and my panels were protected. And as long as I can read that stamp on this side on the top, that means I'm not going to accidentally put the black ink onto my designs. I struggled with a couple of them. I spent quite a bit of time on the striped one since the word didn't quite fit in one of the white stripes. And then when I got to the big tree, I actually changed color and stamped it in red since there was no red ink on the design. Now the word joy can be a little awkward because even though there's 3 letters, it's not very symmetrical, and you can't always center the word by centering the O. I hope that makes sense. Okay, now this one, I couldn't fit the joy next to the arrow pointing to it, so I had to pivot. Literally. I turned my panel so that the triangle was pointing down to the joy. It fit perfectly on the edge of my blending for this angled panel, and then for the trees, it looks like I trimmed off a bit too much from the bottom of the panel, so the joy is extending up into the trees a little bit. Not perfect, and something I would take more care about next time, but it's not a disaster. Now for this last one, I felt like the word needed to be centered, but I was also worried that it wouldn't be legible on that dark background. So here's where you could simply change your approach and maybe heat emboss the sentiment with white powder. And those panels are now done, ready to be used on cards. I added a couple of little details to step them up. The first was to find a little to the world sentiment from Pretty Pink Posh. Adding this takes your cards from general Christmas to a little more of a religious Christmas if that's your thing. And if it's not, I think joy is still a good festive word on its own. You can see there were a couple of designs where it just didn't really fit, so I left it off. I maybe should have left it off the last one. The small font is harder to read in black on the deep colors, plus because the stripes in the design are not straight, it was hard to place it properly and maybe doesn't look straight. So that's another change I might make next time. Next, I spritzed shimmer spray over each panel and I added a little gold watercolor splatter. Again, neither step is necessary, but it does add a little shimmer and shine, which is fun at Christmas. Before I spritzed that one with the trees, I got out my sand eraser, but I could not budge that red smudge. So I went ahead with this spritz and splatter and I set it aside to assess afterwards. For the big tree, I masked off the white sides before spritzing and splattering. Not necessary, but a fun way to concentrate the shimmer onto the tree. And the stripes panel, I cut way down. This was my least favorite of the panels, but now that it's smaller and the top and the bottom are both Samba, it's feeling a little better. I know it'll give me a nice thick white border when it goes on the card. I did a little more masking for this one so that the splatter is only on the ink blending, and then again, I reversed the masking so that the smaller colorful area would get the shimmer. Okay, now let's go back to those trees. That red smudge was still too visible, I thought. So I created some red splatter by smooshing my Rouge ink onto an acrylic block and tapping it over. This is not one of my favorite techniques. I find that when I splatter ink, it always gets too washed out. But it did do the job of making that red smudge disappear, so I think that's the best it's going to get. Now here's a quick look at the finished cards. I took them up one more level by adding my homemade embellishments. I created these with some honey gold cardstock and the lots of dots dies from Gina K Designs. These circles are a bit like flat sequins, so they won't have any problems in the mail, and they add a bit of a warm glow. Like the extra sentiment, spritz and splatter, these steps are all optional, only if you've got time to do them, and time to let the cards dry. Of course, you don't have to limit yourself to one sentiment, but I think it's really fun how it works so well here. And there's a yay in the set, as well as hugs and happy birthday, so these versatile designs really can work all year long. If you haven't got it already, use the link below to grab my free printable Christmas color combinations. It includes 24 festive color combos, including the one I used today. Once you get it, let me know your favorite. And I think that's it for me this year. I want to thank you all for your support through 2024 and wish you a very happy, safe, and peaceful holiday season, however you celebrate. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.